I was barely halfway done painting my old wooden ranch fence when a car pulled up fast at the end of my driveway. A woman I'd never seen before stormed out, waving her phone and demanding I stop immediately. She introduced herself, well, more, like shouted, as the HOA vice president, claiming my fence color wasn't approved. I calmly told her my ranch isn't part of the HOA, and I can paint it however I want. But she didn't care. Within minutes, she was on the phone with the sheriff, reporting unauthorized alterations and insisting I was violating community rules. That's when I realized I was dealing with someone who wasn't going to back down. The strange part? I knew exactly where my property lines were. I'd owned this land for years, and that fence? It sat entirely on my side. In fact, I had a pretty good idea of who really had legal say around here, and it definitely wasn't her. But instead of arguing, I let her call the cops. I had a feeling this would play out better than she expected, especially once the deputies showed up and started asking questions. What they didn't realize, and what she clearly hadn't taken the time to learn, was that not only was I outside the HOA's jurisdiction, but she was technically standing on land that I own and lease to the very community she represented. That little detail was about to change everything, and she had no idea what was coming. The deputy stepped out of his cruiser and walked over with a curious look, not aggressive, just confused. Karen, because let's be honest, that's what everyone was calling her by this point, immediately launched into her story, waving her arms and going on about HOA codes, fence color violations, and how my ranch affects neighborhood property values. He raised a brow and turned to me, asking calmly, "Sir, are you part of this HOA?" I handed him a copy of my property deed, clearly marked with the county lines. "Nope," I said. "Never been, never will be. My land sits completely outside their boundary." He looked it over and nodded slowly, already sensing where this was going. But Karen wasn't done. "He's ruining the aesthetic. It's supposed to be neutral tones only," she insisted, pacing in circles near the fence line. That's when I pointed toward the gravel road that separated my land from the HOA-managed neighborhood. "Ma'am," I said loud enough for both of them to hear, "this fence is on my property. That cul-de-sac your HOA claims? It's part of a parcel I rent to the city under an agreement they pay me for annually." Her face froze for a split. Second, something had clicked. I could tell she didn't know. All the HOA complaints, all the overreach, were built on the idea they controlled something they didn't. But I wasn't going to spill everything just yet. I had more to show the deputy, and Karen hadn't seen the paperwork I brought out next. I handed the deputy another folder. This one had maps, lease agreements, and tax records that showed the HOA's walking trail and even their so-called community garden sat partly on land I owned. Karen's mouth moved, but no sound came out for a second. You could see the gears turning in her head as the realization crept in. All those years of writing up notices, threatening fines, and handing out warnings, she'd been doing it while standing on property that wasn't even under her jurisdiction. But she didn't back down. Instead, she shifted gears. "Well, if that's true," she snapped, "why hasn't this ever come up before? Why didn't the city notify us?" The deputy glanced over the documents again, then shrugged. "Looks like this was all filed fair and square years ago. Nothing illegal. Here. And if it's not part of the HOA's responsibility, then it's none of your business." Karen didn't like that answer. Her face turned red, and she muttered something about calling the board president. That's when the second subplot surfaced. A neighbor named Rick, someone I'd chatted with a few times over the fence, quietly approached and said, "You're not the only one, you know. They tried fining me for trimming a tree that wasn't even on their land." Turns out, there were more homeowners who'd been bullied into silence or tricked into thinking the HOA had more power than it actually did. I looked at Rick and realized we weren't just dealing with a nosy neighbor. This might be bigger. Rick wasn't the only one who came forward. Within the next 2 days, 3 more neighbors reached out. One had been fined for having a small chicken coop, another for parking his RV in his own driveway, and a third for repainting her porch a color the HOA didn't approve of, even though her house technically sat outside the official HOA boundary. It was like a dam had broken. People who'd been keeping quiet for years suddenly felt like they had someone on their side. And the common thread? Every single case involved a piece of land that, according to county records, wasn't under the HOA's legal control. I spent hours going over maps and documents, finding overlaps, boundary lines, and expired easements that no one had bothered to correct. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. The HOA had built a little empire off assumptions and intimidation. Karen and the board had enforced rules on land that wasn't theirs to govern, but they'd never expected anyone to challenge them, let alone someone who legally owned the dirt beneath their feet. By the end of the week, I had enough paperwork to file a formal complaint with the county. The deputy who'd first been called out even called to wish me luck, but the tension wasn't gone. The HOA had called for an emergency board meeting, and I knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. Karen hadn't spoken to me since, but her SUV had been circling my fence more than usual. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more tangled, I received a certified letter at my gate. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a private law firm representing a developer I'd never heard of. According to them, Karen and the HOA board had quietly negotiated a deal to sell off parcels of land adjacent to mine, including a strip that supposedly crossed the edge of my pasture. The developer claimed easement access across my property, citing documents signed years ago that, strangely, bore no actual county seal or registration. It felt like a setup. The HOA wasn't just pushing boundaries. They were trying to rewrite them. If this deal went through, it meant trucks, construction, and new homes right along my fence line, all under the HOA's thumb. And worse, they were using phony paperwork to claim rights they didn't have. I immediately drove down to the county office with the letter in hand, only to discover that the easement agreement was a scanned copy of a draft, never finalized, never filed. The clerk raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the HOA's name. "You're not the first one they've tried this on," she said. That comment stuck with me. It wasn't just about painting a fence anymore. This was a full-scale land grab dressed up as bureaucracy. I had proof they were bluffing, but I also knew they were desperate. And desperate people do foolish things. As I left the county office, I noticed Karen's SUV parked across the street. As I walked back from that final meeting with the county clerk, paperwork in hand, the weight of weeks of drama was finally lifting. Every document, every signature, every timestamp confirmed it. Not only did I own my land free and clear, but the very road Karen used daily to get to her house sat on a strip of land that was still in my name. Apparently, when the HOA was formed, they never finalized the easement transfer for that tiny section of access. Technically, she was trespassing every single day. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted peace. But Karen had pushed too far, involving cops, HOA meetings, even trying to get county inspectors to reassess my property line. So instead of a petty response, I made a bold one. I put up a small but legal gate at the edge of my drive, not to block her, but to remind her that this wasn't HOA turf. She stormed over the next morning, huffing about restrictions and violation of community standards. I let her rant. Then I calmly handed her a lease agreement, one she'd now need to sign if she wanted continued road access. No threats, just business. The twist? She signed it. And now, every month, Karen pays me $25 in access rent, just enough for a fishing permit and a coffee. The same woman who tried to fine me for painting my fence now indirectly funds my quiet mornings on the porch. I walked right over to Karen's SUV, tapped on the window, and asked if she had a moment to talk. She rolled it down just enough to hear me. I held up the county paperwork. "This is the end of the road," I said calmly. There's no easement, no deal, and no future construction unless I say so. She didn't say a word. Just stared ahead like she hadn't expected me to find out the truth. A few days later, I received an official letter from the developer, apologizing for the confusion and formally backing out of the deal. Seems once they saw I had legal documentation on my side and was prepared to defend it, they decided it wasn't worth the fight. The HOA board went quiet, and Karen? She hasn't so much as driven past my property since. In the end, all I had wanted was to repaint an old fence and enjoy my land in peace, but that small act turned into a bigger reminder: stand your ground, especially when you're right. Whether it's about property rights, boundary lines, or just being treated with respect, don't be afraid to push back when someone oversteps. I kept the fence the same color. It's a little bolder now, sure, but it fits. It's mine. And no HOA fine, no false claim, no backdoor deal could take that away from me. Sometimes the best way to settle a standoff is by calmly, confidently reminding folks who actually owns the land beneath their feet.